I'm so excited to share with you my favorite Gambit versus e4, and it might not necessarily be the line that you expect. Dear chess friends, I'm Grandmaster Max Illingworth, and the Gambit I'm going to show you actually starts within the Scandinavian defense. So e4, d5. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to just give a bit of an overview of a couple of ideas before I share with you five really beautiful games where Black sacrifices material and goes on to win in style. So let's get into it. So this video I'm going to be focusing on the move knight f6. Just going to give you a heads up as well that I do have a full course on the Scandinavian that also covers queen d5 and is actually a main recommendation there. But as this kind of free value for you all, I'm going to share with you the basics of how to play the center counter gambit approach with knight to f6. And by the end of this video, you're going to really fall in love with this system. You're going to be ready to start playing it. And for those who want to really master it, well, you'll be able to learn more about that in the course. But let's focus on the gambit itself first. Now, it's worth pointing out why it does have ways to try to avoid this gambit, so I'm going to touch a little bit on that before I get into what the gambit actually is. So basically, if we go back to move 2, a move that you might face sometimes, especially in bullet, if your opponent is just pre-moving, you might see a lot of knight c3. But there are a lot of good ways to deal with knight c3. I kind of focus on the very best move of d4 in my course, but if you do want a lazier option, it still gives you reliable equality. I can suggest playing d4 and then knight f6, which is an approach I've also played in some games where you just get the doubled f pawns. But on the other hand, you get this very fast development, and you basically get an improved version of the Korchnoi-Caro-Kann lines with, knight c3, ef6. It's an improved version because you didn't play the move c6. You're basically a tempo up, because you can then play moves like c5 and play a little bit more dynamically in order to get a very reliable equality as such. So it's a pretty lazy solution of knight c3 that doesn't really require you to remember any theory in order to equalize. Just remember the system and you'll be more than fine. And if they do play a move like e5, which is a move you might see quite a bit at the, say, below 1600 level, that just gives us a much improved version of a French defense. If they go knight f3, you can even pin their knight and put some pressure on their e5 pawn by attacking the defender. And if they are a little bit more clever with the move order and, play it so you don't get that bishop g4 pin, well, we can still get an improved French and improved Caro-Kann with this bishop f5 and only then playing the move e6 so our bishop isn't shut in behind the pawn chain. It's an improved French because our bishop is a lot more active, but it's also an improved Caro-Kann because we got in c5 in one move rather than having to play c6 and then the move c5 is in, say, the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann, for instance. Also, for those of you who are watching on YouTube, do make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it, and also subscribe for more like this. I will be sharing a lot more videos on how to play the Scandinavian against e4. This one is just the beginning. But yeah, just want to really make sure I over-deliver so that you can never have to fear the move e4 again in your life. So going back to ed5, which is of course the move that you will face the most often. Now, interestingly enough, if you're playing this online or if you're playing against players below 1800, I found that the move you'll actually face the most often is knight c3, which maybe doesn't have so many master games compared to the main lines of d4 or knight f3 or moves like bishop b5 or c4 that try to hang on to the extra pawn instead. We will get to those as well, but basically knight c3 is a move you'll probably face the most often in online games and at the club level, even though it's not one of the better moves white can play. As after knight d5, this position, by the way, can also arise from an Alekhine defense, so you might notice that with the ECO codes for those who like to use chess-base. But here white has a few different options, none of which particularly bother me. The one I think I'd faced the most on chess.com from memory was knight takes d5, but that's just little bit of a concession where you just manage to develop your queen with the recapture, and it's also very hard for him to attack our queen compared to the lines with queen d5, where they can kick our queen away and get a bit of an initiative. Obviously, that's not really a problem here, meaning that black is just doing very well. If white does try to put a pawn in the center, like d4, we can just go bishop g4, and we're just going to be really focusing fire against the d4 pawn, and that's a theme we're going to see actually quite a lot in this training and also I cover it a lot in the course. I played Strongest Scandinavian in 2025, where I put the link to that in the description. Or if you are watching this on my landing page, I put the link on the different buttons. But yeah, you'll be able to find it in any case. But yeah, I just really love being able to play these systems. So I'm a bit more of a tactical, tricky player these days. But I also have retired from tournaments. Don't spend like hours and hours every day working on my chess. So for me, the Scandinavian just a great way to be able to kind of use my tactical strengths, be able to get some fun positions I just understand better than the opponent, but I don't have to keep up with the Fury constantly the way I would have to with, say, the Berlin or the Najdorf Sicilian by comparison. Now, if they do play Bishop E2, well, if they're not going to take the center, we can just do it for them. And here is sub I've had really good results with. The idea of D3, by the way, is just to stop out their knight getting kicked away. But if they do play D3, we can just go Bishop F5 and we just castle long. The reason for Bishop F5 is we're kind of making it hard for him to play C3 and pawn storm us on the queen side. But with the king's castle on opposite sides, we definitely want to pawn storm them. We're going to throw the pawns at their king, just get a big attack, and it turns out black's already clearly better, even though white hasn't made any egregiously huge mistakes. So that's all I mean about this whole knight F6 and this center counter gambit being a great practical weapon. If they play bishop c4, which is the most common move in the database, then at master level mainly, there are many good replies, but an easy one is just to go knight b6 and then play the move of c5. Maybe I have a bit of a soft spot for this because it gets a bit more of a Sicilian position, and Sicilian is the opening I played the most with the black pieces historically. But yeah, after something like this, you can see that black just develops very naturally. You don't really have any bad pieces. You do have a little bit of a space advantage to work with, meaning that black is just going to be completely fine in a position like this. You can even meet knight e5 with knight d4 if you want to keep a bit more tension in the position. Just kind of being a bit of our strong point, and we can also go after the bishop pair advantage in various ways. So definitely an unbalanced position with good scope to play for the win. And if anything, it might even be black who's already fighting for the advantage thanks to that space, as I mentioned before. And finally, just to kind of conclude this introduction before I get into some actual games, if they do play knight f3, this is a move that I used to kind of struggle a bit to find the setup I liked, because there were sort of a lot of moves to give black a reasonable position, but I was struggling to find one that suited my style. Until maybe a couple of years ago, when I realized I can just play knight c3 and just play it in a Grunfeld style, where if they play d4, which is what most of your opponents are going to do, you just get this improved Grunfeld, where rather than their pawn being on e4, like in a normal Grunfeld, giving them the space, instead they have the double pawns here, and you can attack the d4 pawn with knight c6, you can bring the queen to different squares and the rook to d8 to attack their weaknesses. It's very thematic and straightforward, but white is kind of the one making all the difficult decisions. And that's kind of one of the things we're aiming for with the Scandinavian, that, Scandinavian may not be purely a system opening, but because we're always kind of getting the same structure of, the pawn on d4 versus the pawn on e6 or c6, that's only one structure we have to master. So it means that when you do go through enough examples, you're just going to know it a lot better than your opponents will. And even at the Grandmaster level, actually, most of my opponents are not really prepared for this opening, and I usually get a pretty good position out of the opening when playing it. You also can play g6 first if you want to delay knight c3, that's also fine as well. Even though I probably do slightly prefer knight c3 at first if I'm pressed. But yeah, that's the introduction I want to share, just to give you a little bit of an idea. And actually, I forgot to mention that the actual gambit is the Portuguese Scandinavian, which is where rather than taking back the pawn automatically, as you might expect, we play this move of bishop g4. I remember I was really inspired to play the Portuguese as black after seeing David Smurden's book on it play the strongest book on it of the Portuguese Smurden Scandinavian. It's funny, it took me as long as I read I kind of forgot the name of it, but yeah, it's called it the Smurden Scandinavian was the name of the book. And I read that book and it really helped me to have very good results with opening online. But yeah, it's technically known as the Portuguese Scandinavian, this bishop g4. And we're going to get into that in some of the next games. But before I do want to touch on one of the alternatives that white can play. For this, I'm going to show you a game from Viscount's 1989 pre-computer era between Marinus Kuf, the Dutch IM, against the English gem Julian Hodgson. And it features this Icelandic gambit of e6. Now, I will mention it in my course Play Strong Scandinavian. I do focus on the move e6, which is objectively the best one, but then you do have to know how to play For example, the Panov Botvinnik attack of the Karakan, so you do have to learn a different opening variation to the Scandinavian to play the move of c6. So if you do want to play it in pure Scandinavian spirit, the move of e6 is a reasonable alternative. I will say I do think c6 is objectively a little bit better, but I do think that with this Icelandic variation, then you can definitely have very good results with this with the black pieces. And also if they do decline the gambit with something like d4, you just get very easy play. You're going to castle, go for the IQP structure, and something like this is just ultimately very, very comfortable for black. Kind of fast forwarding a little bit, but the moves do kind of play themselves from this point. Like there's nothing particularly difficult about black's play here. It's just use the d5 square, blockade the pawn, don't let them mate your king, and you're just going to be more than fine. Maybe the bishop even could go to d6 as a more active square now that I think about it. But anyway, the game saw d6 takes. I might play the move of d4, which is the most common and most natural. That being said, I think if white wants to fight for an advantage, they probably should play the move of knight f3. But even then, you still have some interesting ideas like queen e7, and you threaten this bishop c4 trick to discover a check, and bishop e2 doesn't really stop that because of the pin here, as we see. And queen a4 does get met with b5, by the way, meaning they're kind of forced to also block in their own development. But after knight c6, you do actually get quite reasonable compensation for the pawn in the endgame. Like you get a pretty decent development. You can castle here and play this position where you're just one move away from fully developing your pieces, which does give you some decent compensation for the material. Also, knight a5 is another move you might like to explore. We just threaten knight to b3 and just kind of limit their development in this sort of way. Just saying that this is going to give you some pretty decent compensation for the pawn with your active pieces. But yeah, you can explore that in your own time if you're so inclined. If you really want to focus a little bit more on the games a bit more so than the theory, because I do cover the theory of the Scandinavian very deeply in my Play to Strong in the Scandinavian course. But here I just want to give you a few ideas that you can start playing quickly, that you can kind of work with, and then, add in the details, fill in the gaps from there. So after d4, the reason this is less precise than knight f3, and you might want to pause the video here to try to figure out what black should do in this position. There's something I also do a lot in the course as well, like at critical moments I pause and give you a chance to try to find the solution yourself, because that's just going to help you to remember the ideas a lot more effectively in your own games and just have much better results playing these Scandinavian. So here the key is that we play to move bishop b4. So obviously if we played white played knight f3, this wouldn't make any sense because it wouldn't come with a check. But after bishop d2, yeah, the way they usually play it is to move queen e7. Kind of interesting to see that modern Indians actually think that bishop d2 first is actually a very decent alternative also. So that's also something you can explore in your own time if you are so inclined. Like it turns out that d5 is actually not going to be as good. Not going to be good for white. It's actually a little bit of a trap we kind of set them, but it's something you can explore yourself if you want to. Or maybe, if enough people buy the course and request it, I might even, do a whole update just on the Icelandic to show another way to play it. Because that's one of the updates I sort of was like very close, like, do I include it? Do I not include it? But, I'm not ruling out including in a future update if enough people want it. But yeah, the move Queen E7 is definitely the most in the spirit of the opening. We keep the tension, and here as well we're threatening to move Bishop C4. So again, we've got a few tricks up our sleeve. And in the game, White's move of Bishop E4 actually was a little bit of a mistake in my opinion. Probably Bishop E2 is better because that actually sets a little bit of a counter trap. Where if we were to take the pawn, we actually run into Queen to A4. And this fork is actually a bit of a problem because after Bishop B4, we are just losing a piece here after Queen B4. There's a bit of a long line, but it's kind of worth showing that even though Black does win the exchange, it's only a temporary victory because after Knight C3, the Knight is going to get caught and trapped. And when the dust finally settles here, White is going to just have, a bishop and a knight for a rook, which is clearly a decisive material advantage. So rather than knight bishop c4, I'd recommend probably just castling and just, yeah, playing it this way. Like this is a direction I'd probably explore if you want to really master these positions as black. But again, I want to focus a bit more on what happened in the actual game because the game was pretty fun, and the aim of this is to make you fall in love with this Scandinavian, with this Gambit version of the Scandinavian, as opposed to, presenting it like a lecture. So after bishop b4 takes, white plays a move of queen d2 to defend the pawn and try to trade the queens. If white plays knight d2, it's kind of worth noting that our best move, you can actually take the pawn on b2 as well, but you can also have a lot of fun with playing a move like knight c6, as in the game between Sokolov and Spielman, which I'm actually going to cover like in another video later on probably YouTube, and then just share it within the course as well. So do make sure to keep an eye out for that, because this was the game I was like, do I cover the Kuf Hodgson game or do I cover the Sokolov Spielman? Because they're both just really, really good games, but I will get to this one in a later update just to let you know. So after queen d2, obviously we don't want to just help them develop their knight with the recapture. It's often the case that when there are exchanges, we want them to take us first rather than the other way around. And so that's where the move of knight c6 comes into being, because now if they take, our knight gets to an active square with the recapture. So this is clearly not going to be so nice for white. Ready to have some problems keeping the ring defended in the center, because if they move the rook, then the a2 pawn is on, among other problems. So white ends up playing knight c3. Again, if you're wondering about d5, this doesn't actually win a piece, because we do have the move of long castles, and we use that pin on the queen to just make their life difficult. If they play knight c3, it's then going to transpose back into the game, which saw knight c3. And here black could actually just take back the pawn, that would be perfectly fine, but Hodgson decided to play it more in the Gambit style, playing more for the initiative. And now after d5, the computer kind of likes going knight e5 here, actually. It just really likes this idea of just attacking the pawn and clearing the way for c6 to sort of use the pin on the d file to your advantage, with something like this, for example. But okay, the move bishop g4 also has merit. It does keep the white king in the center, which, given we're playing a gambit, it makes sense we want to keep the attack going here. So after f3, rook h8, bishop e2, black has a few different options. There are some fun lines where you can sacrifice the bishop even. For example, if queen c4, if they take the bishop here, you kind of get a really nice attack with the rooks just firing on all cylinders and the king having a little bit of time kind of getting out of the center here. So this is one approach you can take. Also, even knight e5 and trying to get in like knight c4 is also another option. But in the game, Hodgson just keeps the bishop alive with bishop f5. Because even though that allows white's king to castle, it's not necessarily castling the safety. Because after the move knight a5, the computer kind of likes knight e5 as well for what it's worth, but knight a5 has a bit more, I guess, bite on the queen side in some ways. But yeah, now white has a bit of a tough task of how to defend the pawn. Because say if you play a move like b3, well then c6, and you're going to have some problems with this pin, where white has to already walk a tightrope just to not be in big trouble. The computer suggests a move of knight e4, but that's a little bit computerish, as evidenced by the fact that in these chess-based annotations from 1990, they didn't even consider the top engine line of knight e4, which already speaks to practically how difficult it is to defend such positions. Remember, your opponents are going to find it much harder to defend well than to attack well, because in order to defend well, you have to just be a much stronger player, simply. So g4, yeah, kind of misses the boat a little bit. In fact, it turns out that Hodgson missed a little bit of an opportunity here, where he just played the automatic bishop g6 without thinking, but actually he should have played knight takes c4 in this position. Because now if white takes the bishop, the problem is that after knight d5, it's just going to be very hard for white to really defend their king. They just can't really get the pieces in the attack, in the defense in time. Because knight e2 will run into knight e3, and then you're losing the exchange and stuff. Or actually even more than the exchange, as it turns out. But if you play a move like queen d4 instead, black's just going to keep the queens on the board and just make life really difficult for white. For example, knight e3 is still a threat, but if you play knight e2, you just take it because of the pin. They obviously can't take our knight because we're pinning on the c-file. And if they play something like queen a4, you just get this position where even though, for the moment, white is not, even though for the moment white is up a piece when you play out all these moves, what ends up happening is that after rook e1, white is just completely paralyzed. They can't get the knight or the rook out. The only way they can really get the rook out here is basically to, give up the knight, which is just not really on when black already has 2 pawns for the knight. And if black does try to, if white does try to sort of save their piece, like let's say they, go for king d2 and they try to, save the knight this way. Well, you can see that's very slow, right? So after something like rook b1, say king c2, rook f1, and we, play out this kind of sequence, say h5, king e2. The problem for white is that by the time they actually get around to get freeing their rook and their knight, it's just going to be too late. Like after c4 and a4, you can kind of see that the knight is just not getting there in time. We take a2 and they're one move short of being able to stop the pawn queening, meaning that we do just win. I know that was a bit of a long analysis, but I do believe in showing all of the improvements because I think that's how you really learn the most, rather than just like speed running through the game. So it does mean this training will be a little bit longer, but I think it's worth it to make sure you've really mastered the arising positions and know how to play the middle games, knowing what kind of typical tactical tricks are. So bishop g6. Again, white probably should play b3 here, even though c6 is still going to give black good play. But at least white's still in the game. Whereas knight h3, yeah, not quite as good. Again, don't totally understand why Hodgson didn't just take back the pawn. Maybe he got a little bit too creative for his own good here. But the thing is, the move knight d7 did actually also ask some tricky questions. And for those of you who are more advanced students, like if you're a 2000 plus, it's probably a good moment to pause and try to improve on white's play here. Because it is a good defensive exercise, but it is also a little bit difficult, as evidenced by the fact that Kuf rated 2485 FIDE when he played this game didn't manage to find the one defense for white. So he ended up playing the move of knight b1, which actually ends up being a blunder. It turns out he should have played the move of knight e4 instead. Still with the same idea of offering to trade the queens, but at least it keeps your king safe from this attack. So that after, say, queen a4, b3, black does get back the pawn here after all the exchanges, but the arising position is going to be okay for white. It turns out you can even sacrifice the pawn as white to get a little bit of an initiative to work with in return. But that's the way that the white should have played it, just 94 and give back the material the way one might drop off ballast off a hot air balloon in order to allow you to lift off in a sense. So yeah, instead of that, white played knight b1. If you do want to try and find the move for black, there's actually several solutions, so it makes it a bit easier to find one of them. But yeah, well done if you saw either the move of rook takes e2, where they can't take our queen because of the mate, so we sacrifice the rook, we sacrifice the queen, and then we're just setting up, either a knight b3 mate or even just knight c4, and all the pieces are just flooding in the attack here. That's really what we go for when we play these kind of gambits. Or you could play Hodgson's move of queen b3, sacrificing the queen, because if they take, it's going to be a checkmate as we see here. So white's kind of running out of good options. They played the move bishop d3 in the game, because obviously queen a5, queen c2 is also mate. But after bishop d3, black just gets the pawn back. They're threatening the knight b3 fork. They're threatening knight c4. And white just can't cover everything at once. After queen b4, another beautiful move by Hodgson in this move of rook e2, where again, if they take the rook, knight b3, but if they don't take the rook, knight b3 still comes anyway. And yeah, when the dust settles, white just loses the queen and white just resigned. This was only 21 moves, so we literally just saw a 2-4-8-5 FIDE player lose in 21 moves with white against the Icelandic Gambit. So it speaks to itself how, this whole Portuguese repertoire really puts the pressure on the opponent. And even with Hodgson not playing it in the very best way, missing some chances to take back the pawn right away, that he still manages to completely crush his opponent. So I hope it gives you a lot of inspiration. And with that also, like I used to do kind of shorter form content. Normally I would have stopped here. But I do want to do a bit more long form content. I do think that it is very valuable to kind of see how how different positions kind of play out and just sort of learn from that. I was going to include a few. Just want to make sure I add a diagram as well here. Just thinking what will be the right moment. I mean, this one's a pretty fun moment. We can go with this one as the example. But let's move on to the next game. And this one was played between Erling Mortensen, a Danish IM, against Roy Demaso. And actually, these next four games are going to show you the original hero of the Portuguese Scandinavian, the Portuguese being with d4 and now the move bishop g4, as I mentioned before. Now, on lead chess, this has a really huge win rate. It has something like a 53 to 54% win rate for black, which, if you add in the draw as well, comes like a 57 to 58% score, which is just really massive with the black pieces. Like, even if you're scoring 57, 58% with white, that's already a good result, but getting it with black is just completely outrageous. So that speaks to how strong a practical weapon this system is. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear four games by the Portuguese I am Roy Demaso, whom the Portuguese Scandinavian is named after, by the way. This is the OG expert, and Mortensen being afraid of the complications after f3 and bishop f5, which we'll see in one of the later games, he decides to just play it safe and play the move of knight f3. Note, by the way, that in this instance, that let's say if they play the move knight f3 instead, and we play a move such as bishop g4, you might notice how this can potentially transpose back into the game. You could also have a bit of fun and also play a move like queen takes d5 and d4 bishop g4 this way. Because you might be thinking, well, isn't knight c3 just going to transpose back into one of the normal Scandinavian lines I cover and play the stronger Scandinavian? Normally, yes, but there is also a creative independent option of queen h5 that does kind of allow you to play in the same spirit of the Portuguese Scandinavian. So it's something that you might explore. It's only something I really discovered in the last year or so. So I think, given that I'm a top theoretician, that if it was a surprise for me until recently, it's definitely going to be a surprise for your opponents. And yeah, it's just going to allow you to just avoid theory in case you're afraid of stuff like bishop b5, which I do cover in the course as well. So I do show you how to deal with these different options. But just letting you know that you do have a bit of a choice in how you want to play it, depending on whether you want to play in pure Portuguese style or you want to, play something a little bit less theoretical with queen d5, queen h5 in this sort of style. But yeah, going back to the game, normally these days people tend to play the move bishop e2, and again, these approach with knight c6, long casting the pressure on the pawn. I do cover this in my course. I will be transparent and admit that white does have a small advantage here if they are precise with the move order, but overall you do get the active play that you're looking for in these lines. But white instead plays knight c3, which can actually be a little bit of a tricky move order if you're not so careful. For what it's worth, you can just play queen h5. That's a move I do cover in my course. But in this game, Demaso played queen f5, which is also a very decent approach. And again, just speaks to how flexible Scandinavian is, that in almost every position there's at least two reasonable ways to play it, sometimes even more as it turns out. One ends up playing the move bishop e2, just trying to avoid the double pawns. As for example, bishop d3. Yeah, you can even play bishop f3 and just mess up their pawn structure if you really want to. The computer also says you can even just play queen h5, that the extra tempo doesn't actually matter that much. But bishop f3 is probably the more natural move from the human point of view, let's say. And also with bishop e3, again, we kind of see a similar thing that if they do decide to trade the queens, and you are forced to take because of the queen b7 thing. So take, but you can see that this sort of position, you just have a very solid game. You're just going to play like the normal sort of Scandinavian or Caro-Kann type moves. They have the bishop pair, but they also have double pawns, which I'd say is just as important. And as more pieces get traded, it also is kind of harder to really leverage this. So I do believe I actually do cover this in one of the model games, actually, in the Play Strong Scandinavian course. I do cover a little bit how these sort of endgames play out, so you'll be able to learn more there. But yeah, in all, though, you don't have to be afraid of those structures. And okay, after bishop e2, let's see who's been paying attention. What would be the move that you would play as black in this position? As always, pause the video if you need more time to think about it. So my answer here is that I really like the move of knight c6. And what's so great about knight c6 that you're not just playing like some lazy system opening as you might see some other Scandinavian courses recommend, but you're actually playing an aggressive system opening where it only takes two moves with castles and e5, and already white just has such a hard time avoiding the loss of a pawn. Now it is true white can play this better, that they should play the move of h3 instead and, make us kind of take on f3 and but here we actually have a little bit of a trick. We can still play long castles. We're actually not so afraid of the double pawns because we can avoid them with very nice intermezzo, queen e6. Intermezzos is a a theme I cover quite a lot with my private students in lessons. But yeah, a position like this is just going to be totally fine. The black, the more minor pieces that get traded, the less, the white spice advantage really matters. And your play is very natural, like bishop b4, put pressure on the d pawn. You can also attack them with g5, g4, with the kings on opposite sides. So it's a position that's solid, but also has a little bit of dynamic potential to it as well, depending on how you want to play it. Now, after bishop e3, white already has a bit of a hard time here. To white's credit, they do avoid the threat of bishop f3 and ef d4. If something like this is definitely the sort of thing you could see happening in a blitz game, for instance, with this bishop c6, and there's some angle also even show in my course as well how you can win a piece with this sort of trick. I think I show it maybe in a slightly different move order, like with the queen on a5 rather than queen on f5, but still the same general ideas you kind of see coming up in a lot of the different variations. So to white's credit, he does play the move d5. Black in turn, they have a few good options like e4, bishop b4 are all legitimate, but knight b4 is I think the most natural move. You just fork c2 and d5. I kind of asked white the question of how they're going to avoid losing a pawn here. The answer is they really can't, but they do have the move of h3, which again, to white's credit, they do find. And at this point, black has a few good options. The really creative one is to go h5 here and actually kind of use the fishing pole, where if they take, you just get this really big attack on their king. That's quite an appealing option where, after say knight h2, this actually would be a mistake, and you actually would be already winning in this position according to the computer. I know it's a little bit of a computerish line I'm showing here, but just to kind of show the point of how hard it is for white to really deal with that h-file attack. And I mean, I've used this sort of attack many times to beat many players in online games. Definitely fits with my own sort of tactical and creative attacking style. But in the game, black plays bishop f3, which really is also totally fine here. Just you have to be a little bit careful in that if you do play queen c2, that's not going to be so great actually, because then your king does come under a big attack here, so you do have to be a little bit careful of that. And you can play knight c2, that is a bit of a better option here. And, it seems to me the most natural move, but in the game, black played king b8 instead. I think if I was going to spurn the capture on c2, maybe I'd go h5 and just kind of go for this sort of attack instead on the king, but in the game, black played king b8. G4 is a little bit of a weird move to my mind. I just don't think you really get much from weakening the king side. I think instead this more Tencent probably should just play either a move like rook c1, and I mean I guess he didn't play rook c1 because he was afraid of c6 and black taking the pawn, but you do actually get some compensation here as white. Like it's not a completely open and shut case, like say e4. I know it's a little bit of a computer line, but yeah, it turns out that this is actually going to be going to be sort of okay for white if they do find a couple of these slightly computerish moves to almost maintain the balance. But I realized I was going a little bit on a tangent there. They could also play queen e2, and they can sack the pawn this way for compensation. But yeah, g4 just is way too weakening. Now black's attack is going to be way faster now that we have a hook on the king. And we're not even going to take them c2 immediately. The key move here. And this one I could say is a puzzle, but I did kind of give away the answer before. Is that we're just going to play h5 and just rip open their king. If we get that h-file open for the attack, it's very, very bad news for white. So white tries to keep it close with g5, but now the move knight takes c2 gains in strength, where if they do move the rook, say rook c1, we now have the move of knight d4, which is a lot better than before. They can't really take, because then we just take the g5 pawn check, and we're basically just 2 pawns up here, pretty much for nothing as it turns out. And if they don't take, that's also pretty sad, where they're going to be down a pawn, and they're also running into an attack in the center, so they're just not really able to kind of defend themselves properly, and they are down material, like I said. So trying to swindle, white plays knight b5, trying to turn the game around here. And here's a question for you: how would you deal with this attack if you had this in the game as black? I know that by saying these puzzles makes the videos a bit longer, but I am focusing on really helping you to improve and to learn as effectively as possible, as well as, to keep it fun and entertaining. There's no reason why you can't have both. So here there's kind of two solutions. You don't want to take on a1 here, because then you do run into some problems where white can actually play this move of knight c7. And even though black is up a full rook here for the moment, it's kind of hard to actually keep your king safe. Like if you take the knight, you just run into queen c4, and your king is actually coming under a lot of fire. It's actually pretty scary here, as it turns out. So even though knight a1 is not losing per se, it does kind of throw away the advantage. A practical option is to play the move a6 here and just kind of avoid this attack. It does get a little bit tricky still after knight c7, where the computer points out that you are still winning, but you do have to find the move of knight takes e3 to kind of remove one of their attackers, so you can sort of take their knight with impunity later. But your king is still kind of open. It's one of these cases where you do have to be a little bit precise. But because you are covering queen b6 and you can meet with queen b3, rook b5, it does mean you are technically winning with the extra piece here. You just have to be a little bit careful with the king's safety. Personally, the move I like best is Demaso's move of knight d4, because it still keeps the material advantage, but more importantly, it also keeps the control over the position. It keeps that initiative, where if they go bishop d2, we are ready to bring all the pieces in the attack and just not give white a chance to catch a breather. And in the game after bishop d4, black is up 2 pawns, and the white king is just way too exposed here, and knight f4 is already on the cards. Queen f3, black just met with the move of c6, not fearing the move queen f7, because we do have knight f4 to threaten mate and the bishop at the same time. White played the move of rook fe1 trying to develop, but the problem is that white's down 2 pawns and black has the attack here. f5, knight f4, and with the attack on the bishop and this at the same time, white just resigns. They're just, everything is pretty much hanging in this position. So that was a very inspiring game by Demaso. It just shows exactly what black is aiming for. And this setup with the long castling in e5, this is a really good one to remember. You can play it in different versions, queen on f5, queen on h5, queen on a5. It kind of depends on, what move order you go for, but this is definitely something that, against players below 2000, they can have a really hard time dealing with this sort of attack. And I would say even below 400 FIDE, if we're talking blitz or rapid, this is just a points machine. And it's a way to be able to attack with the black piece against e4, and actually attack in a somewhat sound way, because if you take other gambits, like say the Latvian gambit or the elephant gambit, or some other gambits that are escaping my mind right now, the problem with them is if the opponent plays natural moves, they just get a much better position and you just kind of regret your life choices. Whereas with the Portuguese, yeah, it's not 100% sound gambit, admittedly, if they play all the perfect moves. We'll get to that a little bit later. But if they play natural moves, you just get a really great position out of the opening. And this game between China's first Grandmaster Yu Jiangchun, rated 2560 FIDE, against Roy Demaso. This is from a match in Macau 996 between Portugal and China. Portugal clearly very outrated, but they actually managed to score an upset thanks to the Portuguese Scandinavian. Now, Bishop e2 is a common move. It's actually the most common in the League Chess database from memory, but it's admittedly not as strong as the move of f3 that we're going to see a little bit later. Also, the move bishop b5 is another sort of tip for white I can give, but that's something I talk about more in the course. I'm not going to give away like all of my secrets here, because then it would be like a 24-hour video, and who's going to watch a 24-hour video, on YouTube? That's more for the courses. But yeah, after bishop e2, we kind of get a similar sort of position to what we saw in the previous game. It is a little bit different because we traded off the light squared bishops. But like I said before, it's actually kind of good for us to trade minor pieces in the Scandinavian, because it just makes the space advantage for white a lot less of a big deal here. Also worth pointing out, by the way, you can also play it with the move knight c6, which objectively is probably not quite as good, but I do also cover it in my course as an alternative. But e6 is a bit more reliable, because it means that if they play c4 immediately, you get this extra option of flicking in the bishop b4 check. And then if knight c3, queen e4, you can kind of trade off the queens. And if you can trade off the queens, I mean, just very happy. Like the Scandinavian endgames, much like the Caro-Kann endgames, actually are generally going to be quite good for black. And if they do avoid the trade of queens, you just kind of leverage the double pawns. It's kind of like a sort of Nimzo type structure where white's space advantage doesn't mean all that much, and black's just doing quite well in a position like this. Just play to target the weaknesses, and you will be, more than fine here. But yeah, white played castles instead, which is a more precise move order. Now Demaso played the move bishop d6, which, yeah, maybe is slightly less precise than the move of knight c6 I kind of recommend in my course, but it's a nice thing about Scandinavian. There's a lot of different ways to play it, and you can kind of experiment with different move orders and find what works for you. Even moves like Bishop E7 and Queen H5 are actually somewhat playable as well. Just a lot of good ways to play it. But Bishop D6, what Black did in the game. White played the move C4. It's a pretty natural way to attack the queen. You're usually very happy to see them play a move like Knight C3, because what happens then is that they really struggle to find a good pawn break, because we're just going to cover D5 very well with our pieces, like we see here. And, it's also a position where with no pawn break, it's kind of hard for it to actually use their lead in development. Whereas Black's developing moves is very, very natural, just, rooks in the center and take it from there. Now after C4, question for you, why do you think the Black Queen should go in this position? We've covered it before, but if you need a bit more time, you can pause the video. Also do comment below with what were some of your favorite parts of this training so far. But yeah, the move of Queen H5 is going to be the key. And we're actually setting up a little bit of a trick, like if they play a really careless move, we do have Bishop H2 to win a pawn. Now your opponent's probably not going to fall for that, but it is worth mentioning. Now after Knight C3, obviously the Queen's defended, so we don't have Bishop H2 anymore. But we can play the move Knight C6. Also, if you do want to play more solidly, you can also castle short. That's also going to be quite fine. Like, I play Knight C6 or C6, depending if you want to play it more dynamic with Knight C6 or more solid with C6. It's really up to you. And the Scandinavian does give you that flexibility to play in the way that suits your style. But after Knight C6 in the game, White plays H3, which I think is not the most precise based on how the game plays out. I probably would have preferred to play Bishop E3, and White probably does still have the tiniest of edges here with the extra space, but it's really not much. I mean, this position is definitely going to be quite reasonable. You play like Rook F8, Bishop F8, kind of prepare the C5 break is a decent plan. Also, the idea of B6, you also kind of prepare Knight E7 without your bishop getting trapped, just to kind of explain the idea there. It looks weird, but it makes sense when you think about it deeply enough. But White played H3 instead. And that gives Black some interesting extra options, and we see that in the game with Black playing long castles. White plays the move Bishop E3. In hindsight, they probably should have played the move of Rook D1 first. Would have been a little bit more flexible, maybe. But after Bishop E3, let's give you this position to kind of test your understanding of this middle game, and also just to recap a few ideas we've seen before, just by seeing if you can, retrieve it yourself. It's known as the retrieval method in learning and pedagogy. Basically here, what would be the move you'd play as Black? Let's see if you can actually improve on the move that Demaso played in the game, because he actually didn't play the best move in this position. Spoiler alert. So in this position, Black's plan is basically to go G5, G4, which is why H3 wasn't the most precise. We can now use that as a hook. Meaning we should probably just play Rook HG8 and just go for it this way. And already White has to be played quite precisely not to land themselves in hot water. They probably have to play the move Knight G5, but then the endgame is just very pleasant for Black, where you can play moves like Rook D7, defend the pawn, kick the knight, put pressure on the D4 pawn. Actually, it kind of turns out that even here, like the pawn storm still has quite decent potential, even with the queens off the board. That this is going to give you quite a lot of counterplay. But instead, Demaso maybe misapplied the Illingworth principle here. And for those who don't know what the Illingworth principle is, it's where when you play move A to prepare move B, you ask yourself the question, can I play move B immediately? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can. It's just a question worth asking. Demaso asked this question, said, well, maybe I can just play G5 immediately and just sack the pawn. But this does end up being a little bit of a bluff, because after Knight G5, White is a pawn up here. But he does still have to deal with the attack on the G file, and the fact that White didn't deal with it very well in the game sort of speaks again to the practical strength out opening. Because the move of Queen F3 actually ends up being quite a big mistake, as we'll see in the game. And if you're wondering what White should have done instead, I would recommend for White that they should have played the move of Knight F3. Clearly he was afraid of the move Rook G8 in this attack with mating threats, but with the move of Knight H4, White is able to keep control. You can see that all these squares for the Queen are kind of covered. The Queen's forced to go passive, and then White can just consolidate, like Rook D1. You can either counterattack in the center, or you can play a few consolidating moves just to neutralize any future attack. And white is just going to be just up a pawn for nothing, basically. So the bluff shouldn't have worked in theory, but it did kind of work in practice, because queen f3 was a mistake. Now, you do want to be careful here. Don't play knight d4 and try to get tricky, because you are going to lose the house here. So hopefully you didn't fall for that. But the good news is, with the move of bishop b4, we do have pretty good compensation. It's not so easy for white to defend everything at once, and it turns out that actually the move of rook fd1 is in fact a big blunder here. What white should have done instead in this position here is they should have moved the knight, something like knight e2 or a move like knight e4, just kind of making sure you're not going to lose the knight in a way that we'll see later in the game. Because the problem with rook fd1, and if you haven't figured it out yet, this is a good moment to pause and try to figure out why rook fd1's a mistake. But the answer is that bishop takes c3 just comes. And then after h6, the knight is unfortunately trapped for white. Now, white tried to swindle it and played d5 here, but the problem is that after knight e5, again, well done if you saw this move from afar, white just loses a piece. Or at least, at very least, they lose a lot of material. Because if you play queen g3, which isn't what happened in the game, but if they do play it to counterattack, we just go knight c4, and white's just still losing a piece here. Because if you move the knight to safety, well, the problem is then you lose the bishop with takes, and it all falls apart for white. So white just doesn't really have any good options here. After queen e2, hg5, it's only move 18 here, and already black is just a piece for 2 pawns up. And not only that, they also have the attack as well here. Queen f5, not the top engine line, but it does get the job done. Rook ab1. I mean, the computer's pointing out you can even just really go for it and play a move like rook h3 and, just sacrifice the rook, but just have a massive mating attack. But, okay, that's a little bit computerish to sacrifice a rook when you're up a piece with normal moves. Knight e4 definitely a more normal approach to the position, let's say, just playing with the piece activity. After bishop d4, I really, really like the move that black played here. There's another one that if you want to pause the video and make it a bit more of a lesson, you certainly can. It'll help you to, convert your winning positions more frequently and more consistently. But yeah, just hats off to black for finding this move of g4 here. The idea being that after takes, well, they can't take with the pawn because of mate, but if they go queen g4, they just, we're just focusing fire, like all the pieces are firing on the king side here. You can just feel the energy of our pieces. If queen f3, we have the move knight g5, and then we're just gonna, take using the pin and just completely finish white off in this position. Like king f1, knight f4, and so on and so forth. So to avoid this, white plays queen b2, but the end is nigh. We're just crashing through. Our attack is just way faster on the king side. Knight f3 kind of a nice move to show off and finish the attack. Because if they take, we go h2, and they just get, they get mated one way or the other here. So after king f1, black takes with check. King e2 is played because this is obviously just going to be checkmate here. So after king e2, black finishes off. Again, there's a lot of ways to win from here, but knight g3 just continuing to win in the most beautiful way possible. If king f2, we just go promote to a queen, rook h2, and the queen and knight is just too strong here. Like, we're going to bring the queen in with checks, we can bring the rook in with checks at the right moment, and something like this is, just going to be completely over. Like, just to play out the move so you can see it, like knight e2, rook h8 mate is how the game could end. Instead, after bishop e3, black goes g1 equals knight. If they take the knight, obviously they can't take with the bishop because of the pin, but if they take with the rook, yeah, we just go rook h2 and just give checkmate with queen d3. But after king f1, yeah, queen c4, and we just checkmate like this, and yeah, that was the end of the game. Black checkmated a 2-5-6 GM in 29 moves, and it goes showing, if they can do it, it means that you can do it as well, by just applying these sort of very dangerous attacking systems. I mean, this game was played in 996, I do realize it's like 29 years after, so of course 2-5-6 GMs are better now than they were then, but it still speaks to how dangerous this setup is for white, and how if you know these attacking ideas and the opponent is not a very good defender, which, spoiler alert, is 99.95% of your opponents, then yeah, you're just going to have a really fun time playing these attacking plans and really making the opponent sweat. Now, this next game between Wang Zili, 2-5-40 FIDE, against Roy Demaso, This game's even crazier because this one, black ends up checkmating white in 13 moves, which you think, okay, grandmasters just don't get checkmated in 13 moves, period, especially not with the white pieces. So before you think it's too good to be true, let me show you the actual game. Now, to white's credit, they did play the move of f3, which is the best move here. But after bishop f5, they misplayed it a little bit. The move of c4 is the move that's not the best one. The main one is the move of bishop b5 is sort of the other move you tend to see along with c4. There is actually a better third move for white, which I do share in the course, but I'm not going to share it here because, well, I want to, not just give away, to anyone watching how to deal with our repertoire. I do want to give you the maximum chance of success. But I will, I do show you the technical refutation by white in the course, just so you know the worst case scenario. Like, I'm very upfront about it in there. But for now, I'm going to focus more on the moves that, you're actually more likely to face from the majority of your opponents. Now, if they play bishop b5, you can play it a few different ways, like knight d7, sort of the standard approach, where you kind of say that, if knight a6, you go a6, and you end up kind of getting the pawn back this way with a playable position. Or if they play, something like c4, you go a6, and one of the main ideas you sort of have is to kind of go b5, where you sort of sack the pawn, but you do get quite decent compensation just with your active pieces, and moves like knight b4 are also kind of in the air next move, just really disrupt white's coordination. But on that, you just kind of just mostly play normally and kind of play for a Benko style long-term compensation for the pawn here. And it is actually quite playable for black, as it turns out. There are other moves like also bishop d7 is another approach that I do also cover this in the course as well, so it's all addressed there, but you do get fairly reasonable compensation. Like in these lines, white does sort of get a small edge if they play it perfectly, but if they don't play it perfectly, you just get very, very good piece play. And again, most of your opponents are not going to play it perfectly because there's already kind of a sideline within a sideline. But yeah, white played c4. That's a move that maybe you'll face the most often below 2000. And after e6, funnily enough, white's best move is probably actually just to give back the pawn, but that's not something that the vast majority of your opponents are going to play. The vast majority of them are going to play the move d6 and just grab all the pawns they can. And if this does look familiar to you, if you've been following my content for a long time, I did cover this also in a game between Vibe against Carlson, which I do also include in the course, by the way. So in that case, yeah, well done if you spurn the automatic recapture and instead play the move knight c6, where we're sacrificing a second pawn, but on the other hand, we get this very fast development. And for more details on how to play this sort of thing and to see kind of the trap for black from this position, again, I can refer you to the course and to the game 5 against Carlson. So that's one where you can, if you want to try and figure it out yourself, yeah, you can just see that video from the course. I'll probably also end up sharing it as well, somewhere else in my content. Like if you're in my email list, for example, I'll probably just share the video again for those who missed it the first time. But yeah, that's sort of showing a way in which black can win quite directly out of the opening. But what if white plays a bit better and they play a move like bishop e3, not taking the pawn like Wang Zili did in the game? In this case, there's a few different options. Demaso plays the move bishop to b4 in the game, which is still playable, but I do point out in the course why I think knight b4 is actually the best move for black and what I would recommend. Just going for this very annoying knight c2 fork. But okay, bishop b4 is very much in the spirit of the opening, and if you're not a professional player, you can probably still have success playing it this way. Because after the move of queen e7, there is still white still has a hard time getting out of this attack. White has to defend very precisely here. The move that white should play is actually, and this is a bit of a tough one. If you're a chess master and expert, this may be a good puzzle for your defensive point of view to see if you can defend better than the grandmaster in the game. But the move that white really should play here is the move of queen c1. But yeah, good luck to your opponents to find this. And even then, you can still play knight a5. It's still quite messy and the position's still quite dynamic. So even when they do play the best moves, you're still getting good practical chances here as black. With white only having a small advantage to work with. So you can sort of see, with the Portuguese, it's very high reward, but relatively low risk, unless you're playing a absolute fury hound like myself, who memorize reputations even to very obscure systems. But honestly, that's not what is the case even for most chess players, let alone most grandmasters. It's even not most grandmasters don't have memorized reputation of Portuguese, because you just don't face it very often as white. Now instead, if they play a move like a3 here as well, you can kind of see that you're not forced to take back. You can also just castle and just kind of accelerate the lead in development and wait for their move and then decide on the right moment to take. But yeah, here White made a mistake. They thought that they could be very ambitious. Maybe White thought that Black was just goofing off and just freestyling here and didn't realize that actually this is a serious system for Black. Because remember, in 996, this Portuguese was virtually unknown. But after d5, the problem with this is that now, and again, you might want to pause the video to try to find this move here. Just hit the pause button if you need some time to think about it. I want to try to play it the way that Demaso did in the game. But the answer is that long castles is the key move, and that's often a theme we're going to be looking for to meet d5 with long castles and just, you can see how we only have one piece not in the game. All but one of our pieces is in the attack here. Whereas from White's point of view, they only have two pieces out, and their king is a very long way from castling. So that kind of speaks to the danger White's in. If they try to play Queen e2, we go knight e5, and we're threatening knight d3, and you can even have some fun with moves like b5. It's like a really fun computer move just to, get at the soft underbelly of White's position and just throw all the pieces at the king. Like this sort of romantic style of chess is the sort of chess I love to play. It's a style of chess maybe a little bit lost in the computer era because the computer is a very good defender. But I think that even today, playing against everyone short of, say, two 700 plus grandmasters, I do believe the romantic style is still alive and can still work very, very well. Players like Arjun Gaisi, Gukesh, they play in a very romantic style in their games. So if it's good enough for them, it's certainly good enough for you as well. And actually, Gukesh himself has played the Portuguese in some games. So, if it's been played by a world champion, I mean, you can't go too wrong with that in a sense. Also been played a bit by Carlson, as I mentioned before. So there are strong GMs who have played the Portuguese. It's not just a fringe system. But yeah, in the game where I played Queen at a4, I think if I was White, maybe I would have played Queen c1, but that's already pretty rough for White regardless. But yeah, in the game, Queen a4 was played, and a theme you've seen before now is sacrificing a piece just to get at the White king, and with the move of knight takes d5. So well done if you saw knight d5, but if you did just guess it, I would encourage you to think, okay, knight d5 is the move, but why exactly does it work here? Because, when you're solving puzzles, it's very easy just to guess the move and say you got it right, but it's also important to understand why the move is working. So the answer is actually not the move of rook d5. You do still get good compensation, but you're not exactly winning after this, because white does sort of get time to develop and, kind of survive. The answer is actually the move of queen h4. This is the move that Wang Zili missed, not realizing, or rather realizing only too late, that g3, bishop c3 is going to discover an attack and win the queen like so. And in the game, well, white probably had to play to move king e2 here, but even then, after knight d4, you can see how the piece is all flooding around the king. We're just going to bring the piece in the attack with bishop d3. Or if they try to stop that with rook d1, you can see how after queen e5 that, they just don't have a good defense here, right? Like king f2, bishop c5, they have to, commit suicide with rook d4, basically. If they play knight, king d2, well, then we just have rook d5 and, we just flood in the attack from there. And if they play knight e4, finally, we just take their knights. And if they take our bishop, we're just gonna, just win the house here. And if they take the other bishop, we go bishop to c2, and you can see how in a position like this we are just going to be winning the house. Like I said, king c2, we're even up material here, but we still have the attack on their king, so it's just completely unplayable for white at this point. I have to give the wonky arrows, but yeah, we got there in the end. So finally, after king d1, this is how the game concludes, where black plays rook takes d5. And I think white realizes his days are numbered here, like he clearly just missed this whole combination. If white plays bishop d2, we just take queen f2, and we're actually just giving checkmate here, like knight e2, rook d8. And yeah, this is one way the game could conclude with the crisscross applesauce checkmate. Notice how all of our pieces are involved in the attack here, very much in the Morphy style. If they play king e2, it's just kind of like what we saw before, but where we got in rook d5, meaning it's just going to be, even better again for black, because knight d5, queen e2 is checkmate, and otherwise we're just flooding in with the attack. So what white finally does is they take the rook. We sacrifice the rook in order to give checkmate. And that, my friends, is how a 2-5 40 feet AGM got checkmated with the white pieces in just 13 moves. a pretty inspiring game, right? I mean, I kind of feel almost a little bit silly that I didn't show these games sooner, but at least we're showing them now and giving you the full value. And we have, I believe, I think it's two more. I'm trying to remember if this is the last game. Yeah, I think this is actually the last game I want to show you all. So video train's gonna be a little bit over an hour, but it's all right if we over deliver, right? So here we have the game between Movsesian against Demaso. This from the European Team Championship of 1997. At the time this game, Movsesian was rated 2,630. He went on to become a 2,700 plus GM at his peak. So clearly, there's a very strong player. Like I've played it myself, can say from personal experience his strength. But Bishop B5 is a system that you will see some people play. It's sort of like an anti-Portuguese. Like basically what they're trying to do here is they're wanting you to play Bishop D7 so they can then play like Bishop E2 and avoid the Portuguese and force you into a more quiet sort of position. Something like this, for example, which I do talk about a little bit in the course as well. But the main recommendation I have here is the move of Knight BD7, because I think Knight DB7 just fits very well with the whole spirit of the Portuguese. That say if they go C4 and Bishop A4. Actually, I have a few games this position with Black, which I'll kind of share in like personal experiences within the actual course. But again, you may recall this idea that when they have this set up, that we just go B5. And we just get that Benko style play where you can play moves like Knight B6 to get the bishop pair advantage. Like that's kind of your threat in this position as Black. And if they're just going to develop normally, like E6, castles, bishop goes to A6, you just get very good piece play in return for your material. So it's also worth pointing out that probably White's best move here is actually to just give back the pawn and just make the point that White's going to be slightly better in a position like this. But to be fair, most of your opponents aren't going to play this way because they're going to want to hang on to pawn. They're going to try to punish you for playing a bit of a sideline. But C4 is also kind of move that we want to see. So that kind of explains this bishop A4, B5. Kind of explains why bishop D7 is more the move. And here you've got a little bit of a choice where in the actual course I do recommend the move of queen takes D7 here. Because I feel like that gives you the best compensation. But it's worth pointing out that bishop d7, that Demaso playing game, is also a good alternative. Again, I don't like it as much as bishop d7, but I do want to show it just so you see how it plays out. Now, when White plays d4, I think that Black is just generally doing quite okay after the move e6. Because what happens, even though you're sacrificing a pawn, you do have the bishop pair and you do have a lead in development. And their center can also be a little bit vulnerable to attack as well, so that's kind of why you get good compensation. Now, for the sake of transparency, I should point out that White can also play the move of knight f3 and then queen e2, which is probably the more critical approach by White. But even then, you still get quite reasonable compensation. Like you can either play bishop e7 and again have this sort of Marshall style bishop pair compensation for the pawn, with like rook e8, bishop g4, this kind of thing. Sometimes you also have b5 as a middle game move to just kind of weaken them on the light squares. And you can also play it with queen e7 and play a little more dynamically where you castle long and you kind of get this bishop pair compensation and the pressure on the center. Now it's true White probably is objectively a little bit better in this version, but it's definitely still a position you can make work as Black. Like it's not the worst case, as it were. And like I said, you also have the move bishop e7, which is probably a little bit more reliable, objectively speaking. But again, this is sort of, just showing you the worst case, just so you get a taste of, what the actual course is like. Like, I'm very upfront in showing what the best moves are for White as well as kind of inspiring you, like I'm here with these model wins. So after d4, e6, White decides to take. We already kind of talked about this a little bit. I will mention if queen d3, there is a very fun idea of b5 that you don't need to find this idea to get good compensation, but it's just a really cool little trick I just wanted to share with you before showing you how the actual game played out. So after d5, Black plays bishop g4. It's a very important move to kind of limit their options, and this is actually an example of the Shanklin principle. You may be wondering what is the Shanklin principle. So the idea is that rather than playing the immediate bishop f5, we flick in this intermediate move first and say that in this position, that the extra move f3 is actually harmful for White because they've weakened that diagonal, they've weakened their king therefore. And that's also why instead of f3, I think White probably should have preferred to play the move of knight e2 and try to keep it a bit more solid. Now, you definitely still have full compensation as Black. You can still play moves like b5 to kind of rip it open. But this is the way that the white should have played it, to kind of keep it a bit closer to equality. Whereas in the game, black now is already just doing very, very well. White tried to cover the diagonal with bishop e3, which I think is actually not the best move. I think you just have to grin and bear it here with like knight c3, but even this is still going to be very good for black. Like you can either play the normal bishop g6 and just, play it this way, or you can have some fun and sacrifice a piece for some interesting compensation. The engine prefers bishop g6, but in a blitz game you can also have some fun with something like this. But yeah, in the game bishop e3 was played, black went bishop b4. Again, we want to develop as quickly as possible when we play the Portuguese. So white should probably go knight c3. I'm not really sure why white didn't play this, but it is true you do get very good compensation anyway with either long castles or the engine's preference of knight d7, just going for knight e5, and these kind of tricks are actually a real pain in the neck for white to deal with. Kind of like we saw in the Hodgson game at the start, actually. So after king f2, black just castles. And black is already clearly better, even though he's down a pawn, because at this point, Black's king is just so weak in the long term, and there's just so many ways to kind of get at that king as well. White should probably play knight c3 here, but in the game he plays knight e2. I kind of like the move of knight d7 again, just kind of opening up queen h4 in this, but in the game, black plays rook e8, which to be fair is also perfectly fine here. If they go knight c3, there are even some fun ideas where you can actually play like rook takes e3. And I know it's a little bit computerish, but it's kind of an example of black's potential where, you can sacrifice some more material, just throw more wood on the fire. But you just get to, throw all your pieces at their king, and it's just very hard for white to defend against the crossfire of the bishops at this point. So in the game, white plays knight g3. And at this point, bishop g6, pretty normal move. Computer points out you can also show off with this exchange sack we saw before, but I think from a human point of view, bishop g6 is very healthy. It keeps all the options open, and white played bishop d4, clearly afraid of that rook e6 sack that we saw earlier. Again, let's test your skill in converting the advantage. Let's see how well you've been paying attention to the ideas I've shown already. What do you think is the key move for black here to take his compensation and turn into a massive advantage? And yeah, I do realize I've kind of said he, him a lot in this training out of habit. I will promise, yeah, in the next update, I will try to use like more gender inclusive language in the future. That is something that's important to me. But yeah, in this game, black played the move of knight d7, just clearing the way for queen h4. If you want to play b5, that's actually a pretty good move as well, where you're just going to put pressure on the center. And if they play b3, you can argue that this is kind of an improved version of the knight d7 idea. Of course, they're not forced to play b3 either, but it's just for illustrative purposes. You can see how much weaker the white position is now with the extra options we get with the opening of it. But black goes knight d7. White plays rook f1, and I kind of like queen h4 here, actually, just hitting this way, but the move in the game of knight e5 is also very strong. If they take our knight, we just have the bishops just raking the board at this point. White plays king g1, and I think that most people would probably just take the pawn without thinking, just get the pawn back, have your attack, which is fine, but it's even better to play the move of queen h4 in the romantic spirit. Just maximize the development, develop as quickly as actively as possible. If they play bishop e5, again, we're just throwing things at their king, like bishop c5, rook e8. It's very hard for white to ever really catch up and beat back the attack in a situation like this. You're already rook g3 is threatened, so not even finding time to catch up in development. But after knight c3, black does finally play the obvious and good move of knight c4. We get back the pawn. Their position is still in tatters. In fact, black is just winning at this point. After knight c4, he's trying to defend the pawn, but at this point, black played a move bishop f4, which is still winning, but actually you could also have played the move of bishop e4 and just grab the pawn and had a winning attack. So bonus points to you if you found this idea in advance. But bishop f4 still gets the job done. After rook e1, f5, white is just kind of running out of good moves. If you play like knight to f2, for example, black's just going to trade off everything and just win a piece. And same point applies as well to the other knight retreats. You just play it the same way as black, meaning that white basically just loses material here. And after queen d3, 95 is a very nice move, realizing after bishop e5 we do have the fe4 intermezzo, meaning that when the dust settles, black is just up a piece, and after a few more moves, white finally resigned. So here we see, 2630 feet AGM just being crushed in only 26 moves, which is kind of why I was able to cover the game a little bit more quickly than some of the other ones. But yeah, I hope that this has given you some inspiration. Let me know, what was your favorite part of this bit over 1 hour training that we covered. And if this has inspired you to not just, play the Scandinavian, but to really play it successfully, to become, really good at playing it with black and to turn into a very strong winning weapon, not just for the moment, but actually as a potential like lifetime weapon, then I would definitely recommend that you check out my labor of love, Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025. I know I've mentioned a little bit before, but basically it's a course just sort of taking the very first opening course I ever did, a true labor of love, because the Scandinavian is my best performing defense against 1e4, certainly in lead chess games at the very least. And yeah, it's also a system where you can see you can play it very dynamically, you can play it very solidly. I kind of focus more on the dynamic approach here because it's just a bit more fun for you all to see. Oh, but yeah, it is a system you can play your whole lifetime. It's something that even when I played against masters and grandmasters, they very rarely are prepared for it. And I just got good positions out of the opening with that surprise value. It's very easy to learn and very easy to play, like we've seen here, because you just get this active piece play, and it's only one structure you have to learn. Compared to say, other openings, you have to learn a lot of different structures to play it well. And yeah, I look forward just to seeing you inside the course. So if you do want to discover more about it, if you're watching on the landing page, I do include a lot of information here in this page outside of this training. And for those who are watching on YouTube, I put a link to the to the sales page, like to the checkout page, which has sort of the details, what you're getting, like the different value, just and it's really quite a lot that I've included, but it's also presented in a way that you'll be able to start playing the Scandinavian right away. And that's really what I aim to do with this video, to give you enough that you can start playing the Scandinavian, kind of see yourself, already getting good results with it, and how your friends are having a hard time with it, and then it'll give you that motivation, to get the course and just take it to that next level and get even better results and even bigger improvement of your chess. So I could say a lot more, but that's more or less the long and short of what I want to share. So yeah, I hope that you found this really valuable, and I really love to have you, in the course getting the full value and the full mastery of Scandinavian. But even if you just take this and decide just play it, and you find that just this free value itself gives you really great results, well, already I see that as a success. So yeah, on that note, I will see you in the next training, or in the best case scenario within the course itself. And yeah, until then, take care.